Trump hit Canada with a devastating 50% tariff, accusing it of betrayal. He declared to the world that America no longer needed their energy, their steel, or their friendship. It wasn't just a simple trade disagreement. This was a $750 billion economic bond teetering on the brink, pushed there by ego, miscalculation, and one quiet Canadian response that would flip the entire script. But then, 10 days later, Trump was on the phone begging for a deal. Why? Because Canada did the unthinkable. It didn't retaliate with threats or military force. It hit back without firing a single shot. And in doing so, it rewired the global trade map in silence, weaponizing every commodity America thought it could bully. Fertilizer, oil, electricity. Suddenly the things Trump believed were his to control became his to fear. And inside that White House meeting, something no one could have predicted was unfolding. What happens when a G7 ally gets treated like a trade enemy overnight? What happens when the lines of friendship are shattered and the world watches to see who blinks first? March 15, 25. The White House unleashed a 50% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum, citing national security, after Ontario Premier Doug Ford suggested cutting electricity exports in an offhand remark during a regional interview. What Ford likely thought was a rhetorical statement set off one of the most furious escalations in trade history. Caroline Leavitt, Trump's press secretary, seized on Ford's comment, framing it as a dire threat to American families. Yet, experts like Michael Froman, former U.S. trade representative, questioned the legality of invoking Section 232, pointing out that Canada supplies over 25% of U.S. aluminum imports at below-market rates. But the real danger wasn't just the tariff itself. It was the lack of warning. Trump had launched a trade war without even notifying Canada's federal government, bypassing diplomatic protocol entirely. What started as a targeted attack on one provincial leader quickly snowballed into a full-blown diplomatic crisis. And then came the turning point. Inside the White House briefing, Leavitt held up a chart aimed at painting Canada as a longtime economic aggressor. She pointed to tariffs on U.S. butter and cheese, as though to show that Canada had been unfair all along. But trade experts like Chad Bound from the Peterson Institute saw through the narrative. These protections had existed for decades, openly discussed in past trade agreements, and were no more aggressive than U.S. subsidies for its own agricultural industries. But Trump didn't see it that way. His narrative focused only on imbalances, disregarding the deep, interwoven relationships between the two economies. For example, over 70% of U.S. car manufacturers rely on Canadian aluminum, which means the tariffs would drive up production costs by as much as 14%. In a cruel twist of irony, America's attempt to punish Canada's trade structure only ended up harming its own supply chains. But that wasn't the worst of it. Canada didn't fire back with missiles or threats of war. Instead, Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered a chilling televised speech that shook the foundation of the U.S.-Canada relationship. He called Trump's tariffs a strategic betrayal and declared that the old relationship was over. Within 48 hours, Ottawa was in emergency talks with the EU and Japan, seeking to expand trade corridors and form new alliances. Canada framed the conflict not as a simple trade dispute, but as a matter of sovereignty. The message was clear. This wasn't about tariffs. This was about power. This was about leverage. And the response wasn't just calculated. It was surgical. The absence of raised voices only made it more deadly. Canada wasn't weak. It wasn't floundering. It was standing firm, asserting its rights with a cold, quiet authority that left the world in awe. "We are done being taken for granted," Carney said, and the world listened. Leaders from Germany, South Korea, and Australia quickly expressed interest in expanding trade with Canada, recognizing a shift in global power. The Canadian dollar, which had initially dipped in the wake of the tariffs, soared by 1.7% in just 24 hours. Markets, it seemed, recognized resilience when they saw it. Meanwhile, inside Washington, GOP governors from Michigan and Wisconsin, two key swing states, began lobbying Trump's inner circle, warning of the economic damage being done to U.S. industries. Even Foxconn, one of America's largest electronics manufacturers, predicted $200 million in annual losses from the disruption in aluminum sourcing. For the first time in years, Trump's team saw something they weren't prepared for. A small, quiet nation commanding the global stage, not with bluster or threats, but with calm, unwavering strength. And that's when it hit them. The power dynamics had shifted. Just 10 days after slamming Canada with tariffs, Trump found himself in the most unlikely of positions. He was the one begging for a deal. President Trump stood before reporters, his expression a mix of defiance and resolve. He declared that Prime Minister Carney had called, eager to make a deal. But behind the polished facade of diplomacy, there was a different story, one of escalating pressure. Inside sources, cited by Politico, revealed that it was actually Trump's team that initiated the outreach after mounting concerns from Republican lawmakers. Economic damage to U.S. farmers and manufacturers had reached a tipping point, and the stock market reflected the tension, dipping 2.1% following the tariff announcement. Goldman Sachs issued a dire warning. Prolonged disruption with Canada, America's largest trading partner by volume, could slash 0.6% off Q2 GDP. Yet the pressure behind the scenes wasn't just economic, it was political. The Midwest, a crucial bloc for Trump's 2024 re-election, was reeling from Canadian counter-tariffs on vehicles and agriculture. By April 2025, U.S. pork exports to Canada had plummeted 28% year-over-year. The stakes were rising, and the political cost of inaction was becoming clear. In a public pivot that seemed more like damage control than strategic maneuvering, Trump told reporters that the U.S. didn't need to sign deals. Bloomberg interpreted this as a face-saving gesture, but behind closed doors, the White House was scrambling to draft revised USMCA frameworks. What began as Trump's usual bluster had cornered him into a corner, and now, the next move wasn't his to make. When Trump suggested that Canada was an ideal deal for the American people, citing subsidies and free military protection, Carney's response was sharp, direct, and chilling. "There are some places that are never for sale," he said, according to Reuters. The words hung in the air, freezing the room. Carney's team didn't see Trump's annexation hint as empty rhetoric. No, they saw it as a chilling extension of his transactional foreign policy, one that put a price tag on sovereignty. Canada's defense budget was a mere 1.4% of its GDP in 2024, while the US covered a staggering 57% of NATO's total spending. But Carney, with chilling precision, reframed this imbalance not as a debt, but as the shared legacy of an alliance. The backlash from Canada was swift and unforgiving. The media, along with opposition leaders, accused the White House of treating Canada like a distressed asset, not a democratic partner. Just as the situation threatened to spiral into full-blown chaos, Carney turned the tables with a calm smile. "Thank you for the hospitality," he said, meeting Trump's gaze, then delivering the final, irrevocable line. "We're not for sale, ever." It wasn't just a line. It was the end of a negotiation style. Canada had made it clear it would no longer entertain such tactics. As Trump dismissed trade talks as overrated, Ottawa quietly but decisively shifted gears. By the first quarter of 2025, Canada had increased its non-US export volume by 18.2%, and its bilateral trade with the EU had surged by 27%. A new framework with the UK was near completion, and Canadian officials were quietly expanding logistics at Halifax and Prince Rupert ports. Canada was broadening its trade horizons, and the message was unmistakable. It wasn't pulling away from the US, it was building something stronger elsewhere. Trump had always treated Canada like a minor lever in the global economic machine. What he failed to grasp was the cost of misjudging quiet leverage. In 2023, Canada supplied 97% of America's imported potash, 88% of its hydroelectric power, and more crude oil than any other country. Behind Carney's composure was a diplomatic strategy that resonated far beyond North America. As the Financial Times reported, countries like Germany, Australia, and Brazil began recalibrating their long-term trade strategies with Washington, seeing the Canadian standoff as proof of instability in U.S. economic alignment. What had started as a tariff war had escalated into a global audit of American reliability. While Trump's rhetoric played well to his domestic base, Canada was redefining influence through steady composure, predictability, and unshakable sovereignty. And in doing so, it exposed the limits of coercion in a world where unilateral power was no longer the sole currency. By May 6th, when Carney met Trump in the Oval Office, the narrative had shifted. Trump told reporters that Canada wants a deal, and that the U.S. didn't need Canada's cars or lumber. But the markets already on edge reacted swiftly. U.S. markets dipped 1.6% that afternoon, and NASDAQ futures slid, reflecting investor unease. Politico later revealed that Canadian negotiators had submitted revised terms first, not Washington. Goldman Sachs revised its Q2 GDP projection downward, citing the economic volatility caused by the tariff dispute. The tension in the Oval Office was palpable. Trump, facing mounting pressure from Midwestern governors and Wall Street donors, publicly claimed control. But the documents told a different story. Canada had quietly steered the terms of the deal. The revised agreement included provisions for mutual sovereignty, tariff protections for key sectors, and a non-retaliation clause tied to the USMCA review schedule. Carney had refused to re-enter talks without these guarantees. When they finally sat down, there was no bluster, no bravado. Carney slid the revised agreement across the table without a word. Trump, under immense pressure, glanced at the document, nodded, and signed it without a handshake, without a smile. There was only silence, the kind that ends a war without a single word. The quiet counterpunch had landed, and the world knew it.